The Washington Post, the infamous staple of American journalism, which wrote 16 negative stories about Bernie Sanders in 16 hours. Love them. But the editorial board came out with something laughable yesterday, I believe. Yeah, the 15th. Martin Luther King Jr. was a true conservative, is what it's entitled. He's someone who I look up to greatly. I would cite him, FDR, and Lincoln as my favorite Americans ever to live. And now the Washington Post is trying to say that he was a conservative, despite the fact that he was pro-Union, anti-Vietnam War, and a self-described democratic socialist, as I will read quotes to you later. This article makes no sense. It literally makes no sense. So, I won't keep you waiting anymore, I'll read it to you. Martin Luther King Jr., conservative. It's from the editorial board. That description of the civil rights leader whose birth we celebrate today might surprise or even offend many of the people coming to town to celebrate the inauguration of a new president and the supposed triumph of conservative in some form or another. The current choices seem to range from Calvin Coolidge to Marine Le Pen. But in his way, Dr. King did a lot to preserve, protect, and defend the best of our principles and values. Just as Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was despised by many conservatives of his day, helped keep American society from succumbing to the radical ideologies that brought death and devastation to much of Europe and Asia, Dr. King worked to turn back extremism, violence, and racial nationalism at the height of the civil rights movement, and to keep the cause of essential and long overdue change in the American mainstream. To keep the cause of essential and long overdue change in the American mainstream? So, conservatism is keeping change going, according to the Washington Post. Nope, that's the opposite of conservatism. Conservatism means to conserve, to go back to the way things were, to make America great again, for example. Conservatism means you are keeping things as they are, not to keep the cause of essential and long overdue change in the American mainstream. They're literally flipping the definition of conservatism to make Martin Luther King be a conservative. What is the point of this? It's just rewriting history to fit a specific agenda that I don't even understand. And also, the liberal Washington Post. Give me a break. Let's continue. The faith he defended and helped redefine was a sort of national creed based on what had come to be widely accepted after many painful years as the immutable truth in the Declaration of Independence that all of us are created equal, and on the idea that Americans are united not by race or by particular religious belief or ethnic origin, but by our devotion to the concepts of popular government and individual rights. So, because he's participating in furthering the maxims in the Declaration of Independence, he's a conservative. You know what was in the Constitution? That black people were 3/5 of a human being. And he wanted to change the Constitution. And he wanted to implement the Voting Rights Act. That's the literal definition of change. It's the opposite of conservatism. Martin Luther King Jr. preached to us as he knew we were, as he knew he was, flawed beings, too often given to cruelty and selfishness, yet capable of being elevated to something higher by power of divine love. For some, that may seem to be the language for the church pew rather than the halls of government. But Dr. King showed that it was the kind of language that can also lead a nation to better itself, to renew its attention to the ideals on which it was founded, to proceed, however unevenly, towards equal justice under the law. Unfortunately, we've heard precious little of it, if any, in our national political discourse this past year. My friends, Dr. King said in his Detroit sermon, all I'm trying to say is that if we are to go forward today, we've got to go back and rediscover some mighty precious values that we've left behind. That's the only way that we would be able to make our world a better world and to make this world what God wants it to be. Spoken like a true conservative and a truly great one. So because he believed in God, he's automatically a conservative. I have 80 things to say to poke holes in this logic. So, Dr. King was a known democratic socialist and a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. When he was assassinated in 1968, King was in the midst of waging a radical campaign against income inequality and poverty while protesting vigorously against the Vietnam War. Here's a quote from him in a letter to his wife from 1952. I imagine that you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic, and yet I am not so opposed to capitalism that I have failed to see its relative merits. It started out with noble and high motive, viz. to block the trade monopolies of nobles, but like most human systems, it falls victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. It has brought about a system that takes necessities from the masses and gives luxuries to the classes. Government officials tracked his growing radicalism and feared it. King is so hot these days that it looks like Marx coming to the White House, complained President JFK in 1963, as King was ramping up for his nonviolence campaign in the South. He authorized his brother, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, to wiretap King and his associates. In 1966, King told staff at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards democratic socialism. Call it what you may, call it democracy, or call it democratic socialism, but there must be better distribution of wealth within this country for all of God's children. Yes, the conservative democratic socialist, Martin Luther King, who was compared to Karl Marx by JFK. I can't believe that title for the Washington Post. The Intercept continues. In April 1967, King gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York City where he called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world and denounced napalm bombings and the propping up of a puppet government in South Vietnam. The establishment responded bitterly to King's speech. The New York Times editorial board blasted King for linking the war in Vietnam to the struggles of civil rights and poverty alienation in the United States, saying it was too facile a connection, and that he was simply doing a disservice to both causes. It sounds like the New York Times of today. It concluded that there are no simple answers to the war in Vietnam or to racial injustice in this country. The Washington Post editorial board said King had diminished the usefulness to his cause, his country, and his people. In all, 168 newspapers denounced him the next day. We also need to remember that back in the day, Martin Luther King was not extremely popular the way he is today. A Harris poll conducted after King's Vietnam speech found that only 25% of even African Americans supported him in his anti-war turn. Only 9% of the public at large agreed with his objections to the war. 9%! In 1987 now, 76% of Americans have a favorable view of him, as opposed to back in the day when only 9% of the public agreed with him at the time of his anti-Vietnam speech. That's a massive turnaround. During his civil rights campaign, King had also been organizing workers, for example. He campaigned against the Oklahoma right-to-work referendum and warned that increased economic competition between whites and blacks would undermine civil rights, calling instead for a grand alliance between the working-class whites and blacks. With the Poor People's Campaign, launched in 1968, King escalated this campaign aimed at providing good jobs, housing, and a decent standard of living to all Americans. Decades before, American protesters took to the streets of New York City and other locales to occupy space to protest inequality, King proposed a massive tent encampment in Washington, D.C. to demand action on poverty. Conservative. You know what, Washington Post? It's things like this where you're actually dishonoring Martin Luther King's legacy by writing things like that. I don't really know what your motivation is. Are you trying to appeal to conservative America because you thought that the so-called liberal media doesn't really understand them? But let's not rewrite history. Yes, conservatives have changed history over the course of time, but I'm going to go out there and say it. The ones we championed were never conservative. They were big thinkers. FDR was a radical. Lincoln, while he was measured in his approach, was a radical. And he believed in universal suffrage. Martin Luther King, at one point, had a 9% approval rating. And you say that Bernie Sanders was a radical when his approval rating was much higher. So, give me a break, Washington Post. Conservative, my ass.